everybody, Derek Judd here with Cowboy Criminology. Of course, I am your host, the Cowboy Criminologist. I've been meaning to make this video for a while now as a special request, and I'll get to why this is a special request and from who. Um, this last I don't know, about 2 weeks on Cowboy Criminology has just been insane. We've added almost 200 new subscribers to the channel, which is absolutely phenomenal. It's the last week of July. Uh, watching the number of subscribers climb and the viewing hours go up and the views go up was tremendous. And so, to everybody who was a part of that, I just want to say thank you. Uh, the Sarah Boone series had a lot of good comments, a lot of good commentary. Some of you are obviously a lot more familiar with that case than I was, and I think something that got lost is, I wasn't coming at that from having all the expertise that like Court TV and uh, Law and Crime, some of those channels had on it because they'd been doing continuous coverage. I was coming more at it from somebody seeing this stuff for the first time and the things that I was looking at, but there was still a lot of good information that made its way in there, and I think it created a lot of good dialogue, a lot of good conversation, and I think that's pretty awesome. I think it's safe to say that none of us are going to make it onto the Sarah Boone jury. I think we've made our thoughts on that pretty well known. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the Bryan Kohberger case, and of course he stands accused of murdering 4 college students in Moscow, Idaho. And there has been a lot of speculation, a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of you know speculation, not so much conspiracy theories. But there's just been so much surrounding this case, and and why wouldn't it? I mean, you've got a small college town that has very low violent crime. You have students cut down in the prime of their life by a student studying an entire or studying in an area that deals with violent crime. So there's a lot of things. Uh, there's a lot of things about this case that lend itself to a criminal investigative analysis or behavioral analysis, if you will. And this special request came from my babysitter when I was a kid. She used to babysit me and my brother and sister. And when I was a kid, y'all, I was afraid of absolutely everything. So for me to have grown up to become, served in the Marines and become correctional officer and police officer, and now I'm hosting my own true crime channel. It has to be a little weird, probably for her and for my parents. Like, how in the world did that happen? But so Joe, this video is your special request, and I'm happy to do it. So let me start off by saying that this is all highly speculative on my part and is based off of the evidence and facts that I could actually find and I could actually verify. So there's some things that I wasn't able to verify. There's a lot of people out there talking about how Bryan Kohberger was following one or more of the housemates on social media, and that's a claim that hasn't been able to be backed up, uh, or at least not publicly acknowledged as part of the investigation. There's also a book out right now, and it has received some pretty significant pushback from uh, the family members of the victims as being a work of fiction. And one of the points that they disagree with is that Bryan Kohberger was able to enter the home and go directly to where the victims were sleeping, like he knew the house. And while there may not be any proof of that, we'll touch on that a little later, because they're just, when you're looking at a case, and I used to do this as a police officer. I'd run my case through with a partner, and I'd sit there and I'd talk about, okay, this is what I can prove happened. This is what I think happened. And by doing that, you're able to kind of see where your case is strongest and where your case is weakest. There's a lot happening in this case that you're not making leaps of faith. It's a logical progression in the case. So I'm going to lay this out. This is a purely intellectual exercise, purely hypothetical, purely my own opinion. And you know, uh, if you find some merit in it, great. And if you think I missed the mark, that's fine too. So let's go ahead and start with. Oh, before we get into that, last Sunday, like I said, I've been wanting to make this video for a while now, and uh, Sunday I was a guest host on Katie Zed's uh, live stream, and we talked about frogging cases. And if you missed the video, I think it was a lot of fun for me, but it was a lot of good information, a lot of good knowledge. But frogging is where you have somebody living in your home without your knowledge, and usually they're living in a crawl space, they're living in the walls, they're living in the attic somewhere, and really creepily trying to insert themselves as a member of the household, as a member of the family. It's these cases are creepy. They take obsession to just a whole new level. But if you had the chance to see that and watch that, I want to thank you. For those of you who are participated in the live stream, thank you so much. It was nice to see some of y'all show up and show some support. If you haven't had the chance to go to Katie Zed's uh, YouTube page, look her up. It's KTZED, and she's got a bunch of good stuff, bunch of good content on there. And so like and subscribe to her channel. She puts out a lot of great content, and she found my channel kind of by accident and just took an immediate interest in it. And so I just special thank you to Katie for having me on, and for taking an interest, and for giving me the confidence to kind of keep going, because sometimes it's hard being a content creator. You never know what's gonna hit, and you never know what people are just gonna kind of gloss over. So but anyway, so let's start with Bryan Kohberger. And like I said, we're going to come at this. We're trying to piece together the strengths and weaknesses of our case. And one of the best ways to do that is I always try to get background information on my suspect. And by getting background information, you learn about behavior, you learn about criminal past, even though in a court of law those things may not on their own be admissible or admissible at during trial. As an investigator, it's helpful because it'll allow you to sit here and say, okay, is this the type of person who could or would commit this type of offense, or did I just get tunnel vision, focus on a particular suspect because I didn't have anybody else? Okay. So this is kind of a practical exercise too. So Bryan Kohberger, at one point in his life, uh, sometime during high school, before college, he struggled with a heroin addiction. And if you know anything about addiction, addicts will lie, cheat, and steal to hide their habit, justify their habit, and pay for their habit. Okay. It's not something most addicts are proud of. It's just part of being an addict. And strong drugs, methamphetamine, heroin, cause people not to do the smartest things. So one of the things that happened is Bryan Kohberger actually got into legal trouble uh, when he stole his sister's iPhone and sold it for cash. Now, he was able to complete a first offenders program, and successful completion of that program meant that he was able to have his criminal record expunged, which, that's when you're trying to get into the military, which at one time apparently he had aspirations of joining the Army Rangers. Um, he also wanted to join law enforcement in some capacity. We'll get to that in a little bit. Um, Bryan Kohberger was always described as, kind of the big kid, and he was teased, and a lot of there's conflicting reports in this case, and part of the conflicting reports, some say that, yeah, he wasn't Mr. Congeniality and he wasn't the most popular kid in school, but he wasn't. Some people say he wasn't bullied and teased, and some people, that's all they seem to remember. So, I'm sure just like anybody else, we all tend to remember our high school days different from other folks who were there. So Bryan ends up beating his addiction, and like most addicts, when they overcome their addiction, they turn their focus and their zeal onto another important part of their life: religion, school, fitness. And in Bryan Kohberger's case, he seemed to have fixated on fitness because he ended up losing over 100 pounds, and he ended up going to college. And he started off at a small community college, private community college, and transferred to DeSales. I hope I'm saying that right. DeSales University, where he studied cloud-based forensics. And if you don't know what that is, that's it's mostly used for fraud, identity theft, embezzlement, things like that. But information that's kept in the cloud is all information that can become important to even a violent criminal investigation. So it's kind of something interesting to think about. But his undergrad, his bachelor's, was in psychology, and he also ended up in the master's program there, where he received his Master of Arts in Criminal Justice. So during this time, he studied under Dr. Catherine Ramsland, and Dr. Catherine Ramsland is one of my favorite academics, because while there are a lot of academics who try to write with authority on what they on their subject matter, Catherine Ramsland went old school FBI profiling and actually set up meetings and interviews in prisons um, to meet with violent killers. She's most famous, I think, for interviewing Dennis Rader, the infamous BTK, bind, torture, kill serial killer out of Kansas. Um, Now, there's there's a lot going on there. A lot of times in an investigation, when people can make a tenuous connection between point A and point B, without fail, they will make it. No matter how weak that connection is, it's there. Dr. Ramsland has said multiple times she's not going to comment on Bryan Kohberger. She's not going to comment on the ongoing investigation. And there have been some snarky things said about her. Well, how good could she be? She was, a lot of people have accused her of training a killer. A lot of people have said, how could you not recognize the signs? Well, pretty easily, actually, because as an instructor, you don't have, you may teach one or two classes to a student. And how do you recognize a student that's just overzealous and wanting to show you their mastery of the subject, as opposed to somebody who has violent tendencies welling up inside of them? Okay. um, it's difficult to look at that and sit here and say, well, she should have known, she should have seen, there were signs. Were there really? I mean, I think that's kind of a stretch. I think a lot of times people are making that connection when there isn't one. The other one that came out was that Bryan Kohberger was trying to interview BTK, or they had some kind of correspondence, and BTK's daughter actually said that couldn't be further from the truth. To her knowledge, her dad had no knowledge of who Bryan Kohberger was, that he had never reached out to him in any capacity. And so, like I said, be careful of the internet sleuths and things like that, because Catherine Ramsland was linked to BTK, and because Bryan Kohberger was a student of hers, people automatically made that connection, especially when we get to a research project that he was conducting. Okay. Um, but nobody at the sales really seemed to have anything bad to say about him. I mean, he was kind of quirky, and that's not uncommon for academics to be quirky. And a lot of times people will stay in academia, and this is not meant as an insult, it just is what it is, because they find a place where they're accepted, their intellect is something to be respected and revered, and something that makes them, within that environment, makes them popular, sought after, one thing or another. But you'll notice that outside of academia, a lot of times these individuals have a hard time relating to people who aren't academics. Okay. And a prime example of that was, some of his classmates described him as being leveled, very kind of even keel, but still very imposing, having an intense stare, and it didn't show a whole lot of emotion. Okay. So right there, we kind of have something. Is this somebody who's just overly studious and taking academics very seriously and wanting to buckle down because they have scholarships on the line, they have uh, internships on the line, one thing or another, where they have to put their absolute best foot forward? Okay, all of those things need to be considered, and you can't just take those statements from other classmates, take them and run with them as anything more than observation. Okay. So he gets accepted to a PhD program at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. And so part of academia, whether it's a master's degree program, whether it's a PhD program, is you're going to be required to do original research. Okay. Now this is where people started trying to connect dots that don't. There's no evidence that they were there. Okay. But I want to read this verbatim because I don't want to mess this up because this is very important. During this time, Kohberger was working on a research study with other students. The study itself is pretty mundane. Most of these things are because they're mostly written by people with no real criminal justice experience and very little life experience. So a lot of the questions that they're asking are inferences that they've come up with from textbooks, from discussions with advisors, uh, questions that they see a violent crime being committed or any crime committed, and they're trying to wrap their head around how this crime got committed. Okay. Um, there are some questions. If they were authored by Bryan Kohberger, they could be important at his trial. And if I was involved in the investigation, I of course would get a hold of his research partners and I would try to figure out which questions were specifically written by, suggested, or approved by Bryan Kohberger. Because I would imagine that if these were the questions that were really central, really the things that Bryan Kohberger wanted to know, there is a very good chance that this shows that escalation from fantasy to preparation. Okay, um, but you also have to look at the other side of that. A lot of the case, a lot of the mystery, a lot of the intrigue kind of starts to fall away, at least behaviorally, if Bryan Kohberger didn't have anything to do with these questions. Okay, so that's why it would be important for me if I was the investigator, uh, to talk to his research partners. Now, a lot of people are like, "Well, wouldn't you want to talk to Bryan Kohberger?" Well, yeah, but do y'all see a difference between Bryan Kohberger and some of the other uh, legal scholars we've talked about on this channel? What is the key difference between Bryan Kohberger and these other folks? Well, one, we don't really see specifically any video evidence of him actually committing the crime. Now, before you get too excited, keep watching because we're going to go deeper into what evidence does tie him to the crime. But what I'm trying to get to is he asked for a lawyer. Very, very early on in the case, he asked for a lawyer. Makes him a pretty smart, pretty confident defendant, or maybe not confident, but at least understanding his situation is intense enough that he can't handle it on his own, so he's going to seek out counsel. You'll notice that has not always been the case with people we've talked about on this channel. Um, the Sarah Boone case comes to mind, and he seems to be cooperating with his attorneys in that score, and this has actually made their job easier because the states what we know about the state's case right now is it appears to be largely circumstantial. Now, this is a case that from the outset has been played very close to the vest, and for very good reason. First off, you don't want any missteps in your investigation that are going to let a quadruple murderer get away with what they did. there's good and bad to conducting an investigation that way. The good part of it is you control the media or you control what gets out, but you don't necessarily control the inferences that people make. Early on in the case, I remember uh, the family of one of the victims stating that they were going to or had retained a private investigator and they were going to start conducting their own investigation. Excuse me. They were going to start conducting their own investigation because they didn't feel like the case was moving along. And I was asked about that while I was a police officer. One of my officers came up to me and said, "Hey, what do you think about this case in Idaho?" It's horrible. What else is there to say? And he's like, "Well, he's like, do you think that they have any evidence? Do you think they have any leads?" And I said, "Yeah, they absolutely do." And he's like, "Well, why aren't they saying it?" Well, do you want to tip off your suspect and have him run, especially if you don't have any reason to make contact with him, if you don't have any reason to arrest him? You could actually scare your main suspect into running and losing track of him. And that's not something you want to do. So, if you're going to conduct an investigation like the department in Idaho did, you really need to consider having a victim's advocate and an officer liaison assigned to the case. And it'll be the job of the liaison and the advocate to keep the family in the loop. And it wasn't until I think the family got brought in and brought up to speed on the case that I think the families kind of took a breath and stepped back, because obviously they have more of a vested interest in law enforcement in the killer being brought to justice, right? They lost family members in a horrible and violent way. So yeah, they want to see justice done, and they don't want to step on any toes in that regard. Um, I will say that behaviorally, it makes criminal investigative analysis in a case like this very difficult. And the same officer who was asking me about it was like, "Well, you're the behavior guy. What do you think? Who did it? Who did it? What was his motivation?" I said, "I can't tell you his motivation." And he said, "If you had to guess, who do you think they're looking for?" I don't know. White male, 25 to 35, organized offender, uh, probably if probably either an instructor or somebody who works on campus. If it's a student, it's probably going to be somebody who's older and either pursuing a master's or graduate degree. And he's like, "Well, what else can you tell me?" I was like, "I don't know. The guy didn't call me up beforehand and tell me what he was going to do. Like, there's only so much information, and you know, even that was taken a very, very long shot in the dark. And if I was actually there conducting the investigation, while my first thought might have gone there, I probably would not have shared that with anybody. Okay. Um, because if you get used to doing criminal investigative analysis, you can build your theories and you can start to see how your theories are guided by the evidence. And if evidence comes up and it changes your theory, that's fine. But very, very often you will throw out an off the cuff comment, kind of like my 2 cent analysis, because I think that's probably all it was worth at the time. Uh, But you will say that to another investigator or the head of the investigation, and they will want to run with that and use that as the only guiding principle, regardless of what the evidence says, and that's very dangerous. So that would be a conversation that if I was part of the investigation, it would be one of those between you, me, and the fence post kind of things. So I want to read this to you. So, like I said, let's just keep in mind these questions would only really be relevant based on whether they were suggested by Bryan Kohberger or whether he got excited about including them, demanded that they be included, what have you. But I want to read this to you. So, after completing a series of background questions, you will be presented with open ended questions relevant to the most recent crime you were involved in and asked to detail your thoughts, emotions, and actions from the beginning to end of the crime commission process. In order to best understand your unique psychological traits, surveys will be included after the open ended section. Please be assured that your responses will be kept completely confidential. All right, that's just part of doing good research. Is if you're going to get people to talk about things that can get them sent to prison, you have to ensure confidentiality. And a lot of times there's a lot of problems with doing surveys like this because self-reporting, people tend to over-report or under-report more than they tell you exactly what happened. And so, but if you're just trying to get if you're just trying to get a an overall kind of idea, I mean, I've seen worse, I've seen better, as far as research goes. Okay, so these are some of the questions that really kind of stuck with me. 12F. Did you struggle with or fight the victim? 13. How was your life right before the crime occurred? Now that seems like kind of an innocuous question, but there's a lot of echo in that question. Was your life falling apart? Were you fighting with a spouse or family member? Did you lose your job? Did you lose your financial security? Did you lose status? What happened? What was going on directly before you committed the crime? Okay. Did you prepare for the crime before leaving your home? Okay. Premeditation, right? Please detail what you were thinking and feeling at this point. How did you travel to and enter the location that the crime occurred? After arriving, what steps did you take prior to locating the victim or target, i.e., person or object? Please detail your thoughts and feelings. Why did you choose that victim or target over others? Before making your move, how did you approach the victim or target? Please detail what you were thinking and feeling. What was the first move you made in order to accomplish your goal? Please detail any thoughts and feelings at this point. 20. How did you accomplish your goal? Please explain what you were thinking and feeling. 21. Before leaving, is there anything else you did? Is there anything you did to avoid detection? Is there anything that you did to make sure that nobody was a witness? 22. How did you leave the scene? 23. After committing the crime, what were you thinking and feeling? What follows are surveys that are important to understanding your unique traits. 24. Over the past 2 weeks, how often have you been bothered by any of the following problems? And there's a whole list it goes down through. Questions 26, 2, and 3 ask, you secretly commit a felony. What is the likelihood that you would feel remorse about breaking the law? 3. At a coworker's housewarming party, you spill red wine on their new cream-colored carpet. You cover the stain with a chair so that nobody notices your mess. What is the likelihood that you would feel that the way you acted was pathetic? Now, that's kind of interesting because a lot of times violent criminals are described in their everyday lives as being pathetic. They're always making excuses that makes them pathetic. The way they choose to live their life makes them pathetic. The things that they seek out make them pathetic. The story they give, the reason they give for doing something is pathetic. And so that's kind of something that you see in a lot of violent serial sexual assaults and serial killings. That word seems to creep up an awful lot. So just something to consider. And a lot of the word choices seem a little odd, especially for an academic research project. And a lot of times academics are trying to use relatable vocabulary and speak at a level that most offenders would probably be used to. I seem to remember reading a prison survey from US Bureau of Prisons, and I think they did a breakdown of the education level on average of most criminals that were currently incarcerated in state prison facilities, and I want to say it was like ninth grade was the overall average. So they wanted to keep their questions at around a ninth grade level. So I would expect most of the other questions on the survey, like I said, they were all pretty mundane, not really a whole lot of meat on the bone. And once again, those questions could have been authored by any one of four other people attached to the project. Um, so you can't really sit there and say one way or the other. Those were just questions that kind of stood out to me in light of what he's accused of. And so I think this project would actually be, like I said, good behaviorally to go and talk to his research partners and ask them, hey, these are some questions that I have questions about. Who authored them? Who approved them to be in the study? Was anybody happy about these questions being included, or did anyone get excited about these being included? And a big part of that would be letting the research partners know, hey, y'all aren't in trouble for any of this. Okay, this is not this is not something that we're trying to say you were part of, or that you created this whole thing. And you would also have to take that with a grain of salt, because if the research partners feel like they're responsible in any way for this, you know, they could easily take a question that they were asked or they wanted in the survey and say, "Oh yeah, that was Bryan, and oh yeah, he was doing cartwheels when we included it." So it would also be important to interview them separately and not let the individuals know what questions are being asked in the interview in order to fully understand the team dynamics of the project. I think that's a good way to say that. Okay. So, as a PhD student, of course, Bryan Kohberger was a teacher's aide, teaching bachelor level classes, trying to understand how to teach, being taught how to teach. The way he was described as an instructor is described as there's always seemed to be uneasiness surrounding Kohberger. not just in his classes, not in the classes he taught, but in the classes that he was a student. One student commented that he often interrupted female instructors or completely ignored them while they were speaking, and sometimes he just quit showing up to their classes altogether. How relevant is that information? All right, he's charged with killing 3 females and 1 male. That is something that is certainly interesting. I don't know that I'd hang my hat on that. And let me explain why. He trained under Dr. Catherine Ramsland, who is a preeminent forensic psychologist and has interviewed hundreds of violent offenders. Okay. It would be difficult to sit in class and learn from somebody who only read the research that somebody I personally studied under had actually gone out and done. So that seems to be, you could kind of use that as a tipping point one way or the other, but I I think I'm more to the point where his treatment of his female instructors was more due to the fact that he didn't think they knew what they were talking about, and he felt like he knew more than they did. Okay. Now, as a teacher's aide, Kohberger was fired uh, just several days before his arrest. December 19th, I think, is the date he was fired. But he lost his position for a variety of reasons. One, he couldn't get along with the professor that he was a teacher's aide for, and he had been talked to multiple times about his professionalism. And there were starting to be mounting allegations about being sexist. Comments he would make to female instructors, female students, um, whether the students were those that he was teaching or those that he was in class with. And one of the biggest problems was that he often used 2 different scales to grade work, one for men and one for women. Of course, you can't do that. One source that I read stated that other teachers' assistants noticed that Kohberger would host office hours for females later into the evening after most of the other TAs and faculty had left for the evening. And that started to make people uncomfortable. And that's just not a position that you put yourself in on a college campus in America in this day and age. I'm sorry, you just don't. You are asking for so much trouble. Okay. Um, he was often known to be very condescending towards females in his classes. One student, a fellow classmate of his, apparently he had asked her out so many times, and he was always leering at her. He would make inappropriate comments that people assumed were being directed at her. And it made people feel so uncomfortable for her that they would not allow her to be alone with Bryan at any time. They felt very uneasy about that, about his behavior. So he's warned multiple times about his behavior, about his lack of professionalism. He's put on an improvement plan. Improvement plan is just HR speak for, this is the level we want to see you at. This is where you're at right now, and these are the steps we want to see you take. And if you can't raise your level of performance, you're going to be let go. Okay. And apparently Bryan was only able to make marginal improvement at best in his professionalism, and that kind of threw things off. Now, something interesting happens at this time. So, one of the things you're always looking for in an investigation is a stressor. Okay, the stressor is that tipping point in an offender's life where they go from fantasizing about committing a crime to actively committing it. Okay. Now, Bryan didn't lose his job until 3 days before his arrest, uh, but almost 2 months after the killings happened. So his behavior during this time becomes very important. We need to know what kind of changes were happening. Was he becoming more defiant? Was he becoming more uh, abrasive during this time? What was his? This is the pre-offense behavior we're looking for. All right, what was going on in his life? Was he pretty sure that things were imminent, that he was going to be fired, and that became the stressor for him? We don't know. There's not a whole lot of information. What we do know is after the murders, his students that he was charged with teaching all reported miraculously that he became very preoccupied. He was completely different. Remember, we talked earlier about how he was very intense, very imposing, but now all of a sudden he's preoccupied, almost like, there's other things that need his attention, but his grading changes. And now his grading standard, whatever it was, has become very, very relaxed. I came down with a cough last week, and I just have not been able to shake it. uh, so at the time of his arrest, Washington State University released a statement saying that uh, that Kohberger was no longer a teacher's aide, uh, and that he wasn't enrolled in class. So the end of the semester, was he not enrolled in class because he was waiting till after the new year to re-enroll? Was he not planning on coming back? Nothing, nothing that I found seems to show one way or the other. The only thing that we know is he wasn't registered as a student, and if you're not currently registered as a student, you're not counted as a student. So, and of course, due to a federal mandate called FERPA, um, schools are not going to release information about a student teacher. Okay, uh, but this is the start of a nearly 3 week winter break. So, was he waiting to get a financial situation straightened out, waiting for scholarships to be approved before he applied for a certain number of classes? Who knows? That right there, out of the entire analysis, that's probably the part that I'd take with the biggest grain of salt. Okay. So now let's talk about the evidence that we know of. Okay. Um, Part of the search warrant that was released after Bryan Kohberger's residence was searched, excuse me, found human and animal hair in his apartment. And we don't really know we don't really know with any concrete proof. Like I said, this case has been played close to the vest almost from the beginning, so there's no reason to think that that changed now. But if human and animal hair was found in his apartment, it's very likely that it was in the vehicle as well. These four students were stabbed to death in the early hours of November 13th. Okay. Um, they also seized a vacuum that Bryan Kohberger is known to have used to clean out his car. Of course, vacuums are great for trace evidence. Um, there's something called Locard's theory of transference, and Locard was a criminologist who, kind of the father of forensics. He made the observation that it is impossible for you to enter a space and not leave a trace of yourself. He also said that once you leave that space, it's impossible for you to leave that space without taking something from that space with you. Okay, and we do know that there was a dog in the residence at the King Road house where the crime was committed, and we know that Bryan Kohberger did not have a dog, at least not that we know of. Okay, they found knives. They took his phone, of course. That's digital forensics. Phones are just a gold mine, and you never want to not pick up the phone. And an assortment of different black masks. In the Northwest, in the wintertime, that can be significant, and it might not, just depending on, is this person an avid outdoorsman, avid skier, spend a lot of time outside? Would it be unreasonable that somebody would have those masks? I think they found some gloves, but nothing, at least that's been released, that's tied to the King Road house. Based on the different descriptions of the crime scene, and the weapon that's purported to have been used, it's highly unlikely that he would have been able to commit the crime and leave the scene without having trace evidence of blood on his person. And so it'd be interesting to see once we get further on, because I think the trial is set for June of next year. I think it'll be interesting to see what evidence was collected, what the significance of the evidence that was collected, and what forensic evidence was gleaned from that. Now, they also said that at the murder scene, there was a sheath to a K-bar knife, and it was stamped with USMC. If you know anything about the military, the K-bar knife is kind of synonymous with the United States Marine Corps. It's usually stamped USMC on one side, and the sheath is usually marked USMC. But that sheath contained a DNA sample that, when they found the DNA sample, they compared it to trash taken from Bryan Kohberger's parents' house. And a DNA sample from the dad showed a 1 in 2 billion chance that the DNA on the sheath came from somebody who wasn't a son of Bryan Kohberger. Okay. Now, is that the sheath itself being there circumstantial? Even with the DNA, it can be explained. The knife got lost. Somebody found it. They decided they were going to commit this crime. Okay, maybe. But I keep going back to something that I read in an interview where somebody was talking about the potential that Bryan Kohberger was being framed. And in a very matter of fact statement, the individual said, nobody cares enough about Bryan to set him up for something like this. It doesn't make any sense. And I would have to agree. Okay. Um, some of the other evidence that was found, there was a firearm. Not unusual for the offender in a stabbing case to have a firearm with them in order to quickly overcome resistance or keep somebody from fighting back. The knife is the actual implement that they want to use, but if you lack criminal sophistication, or you're going into an environment where you may have to subdue multiple people, a firearm helps you do that a lot easier than a knife. Okay. A book was underlined, or a book was found, and it had been underlined. Now, they don't say what the book is, but given that Bryan Kohberger was getting a PhD in criminal justice criminology, something like that, not unusual for a college student to have books, supplemental reading materials that are underlined. So, depending on what the book is, may or may not be as significant as people want to think. Um, Now, originally, the police department said they were looking for a white Hyundai Elantra, uh, 2011 to 2013. But I looked up the vehicle from model years from 2011 to 2016, and there's very little difference between them. Looking at them from the front, looking at them from the back, there's not a whole lot. There's not a whole lot of difference there, and well, I'm not a car guy. I'm not one of those guys who can look at headlights or taillights and say, "Oh, that's this type of vehicle." Um, and I'm certainly have very little interest in Hyundais. Um, Surveillance video from a neighboring house showed a white Hyundai Elantra attempting to get out of the neighborhood quickly, made a weird kind of 3-point turn as it was described, and then took off. And this vehicle is on scene like 3 other times before that, coming into the neighborhood and circling the house. A doorbell camera captures what sounds like muffled cries, a loud thud, and a dog barking. And then it shows the suspect vehicle leaving the area at a high rate of speed. So now we're kind of getting into okay, we have some behavioral evidence that is starting to lead us to believe that, based on everything going on in Bryan Kohberger's life, he has the potential, probably more than anybody in that area, to have the knowledge, the ability, and the background to be capable of committing this type of crime. Okay. One of the things about Bryan Kohberger is that he's described as, no matter what the subject is, he's always going to be an expert on it, and he is going to describe the most complicated way to explain something, no matter how simple it is. This would be consistent with somebody who, or I would expect to see that type of personality in somebody who would enter an occupied residence with at least 4 people in it and commit this type of crime. Okay. Um, so now we've got the cell phone data, and the The first thing I want to look at is, okay, so sorry about that. I've got it. Okay, so Bryan Kohberger's phone pings off the tower of the cell phone tower nearest the victim's home on Kings Road like 13 times from August to November. Okay, so in a 3-month time span. Starts August 21st, 2022. Bryan Kohberger's phone is picked up close to Moscow Murder House between 10:34 p.m. and 11:35 p.m. He makes 11 subsequent visits before the November 13th murders. Okay. November 13th, and you can follow along. So you've got, it's all labeled 1 through 10. So the second one says November 13th, 2022, 2:42 a.m. Kohberger's phone is picked up near his home in Pullman, Washington. Okay. 2:47 a.m. phone began to travel south through Pullman before going offline. Okay, taking 195 south. 4 a.m. to 4:20 a.m. Maddie Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapman are murdered. Okay, so that's the time frame. 4:48 a.m. Kohberger's phone pings again on Idaho State Highway 95 south of Moscow. Okay. 5:30 a.m. phone arrives back at Kohberger's home. The route he took, you'll see here in a second, takes, normally you could make that drive in 16 minutes, but Kohberger took a route that was nearly an hour and a half long. 9 a.m. Kohberger's phone begins to move. Phone is 9:32 a.m. Phone is picked up near Moscow Murder House again. So you got to wonder, what are the odds that somebody just out for a drive happens to go by a house where a quadruple murder is committed, not just once, but twice? Okay. That seems to be, that seems to raise some suspicions right there. All right. Now, the defense, Bryan Kohberger's defense is arguing that he often liked to take drives, go out by himself, whatever. Okay, I like to drive too, but looking at this map, it seems like if you have car trouble, help is kind of far away. All right. So turning off your phone in a place where you may or may not have service seems weird. Now, there is a difference in cell phone data when a phone is turned off versus being placed in airplane mode. Okay. And so that's how we can kind of follow that route. And this is the graphic that I'm showing you says possible route, but it's the only route that really makes sense from the beginning to end. Okay. 12:36 Kohberger drive past Kate's Cup of Joe coffee stand. 12:46 Kohberger visits Albertson's grocery store, and that's down in Clarkston. You pulling up satellite images of Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, Washington, it seems like going a long way to go to the grocery store. I mean, I like to think I have brand loyalty, but I'm not driving an hour and a half out of my way to, for my produce. That's very odd, and it would be very difficult to explain. So, I was talking about coincidence. Coincidences do happen. And I have a one coincidence rule per investigation. One thing happens, it's a coincidence. Two coincidences happen, And no, somebody is trying to make this look like something else is going on. I think it's unlikely that Bryan Kohberger would have been a guest in the house like he attended a party, because I think somebody would have recognized him, like when his picture's been posted everywhere. And somebody would say, yeah, I saw him at a party here, or would have been able to create some kind of tangible connection. Like I said, this next infographic I'm going to pull up, it shows Google Maps shows the quickest route between Pullman, Washington, and Moscow, Idaho, and it's like 16 minutes. It's only like 9 miles away. So that doesn't make any sense. And the next route, show you with all the stops and everything, it's like an hour and 24 minutes according to Google Maps. Now, if it's true that he likes to go out and drive on his own, I would expect to see his cell phone going off when he's on these drives. He doesn't want to be disturbed, so he wants complete isolation. He turns his cell phone off. That is a pattern that can be found. Okay. The problem is his phone pings. Uh, Let me make sure I got this right. Okay. So on multiple occasions, his phone pings near this the Kings Road house, and there's no real connection that we've been able to confirm. Some people have said that he was following one or more of the roommates on social media, and that hasn't been confirmed. So I'm not really adding that into this. And it would certainly be a nail in the coffin, as it were, if he was. But his defense is maintaining that he has no association with anybody in the house, so he has no business, being there. But we just said his phone pinged from the tower closest to the Kings Road house. But if you look at this next infographic, this is the one that kind of shows you where the house is located and just how far off the interstate it is. You'd have to know where it is, or you'd have to be trying to find it. And that's a problem I don't think the defense is going to be able to overcome easily, if they're able to overcome it at all. Okay. So nowhere, like the main thoroughfare is far north, and even if he liked doing that long drive, there's no reason for him to go to where the King's Roadhouse is, because there's just nothing over there. All right. So it seems rare, and his phone is picked up at that house so many different times that it raises more questions than it answers. If digital forensics, cloud-based forensics, is able to go through his phone and find that he doesn't have a habit of turning his phone off when he drives, he doesn't have a habit of taking that long, almost hour and a half route instead of the direct 16-minute route, that's going to show that wasn't common for him. Also, if there's no movement on his phone during the hours of, say, midnight and 5 a.m., except for the 13th, that's going to raise some red flags. There's a lot of things that are just too hard to explain, and lacking any other explanation that can come with other evidence. And of course, that would force us to reevaluate. It's really hard not to see a connection. Now, his defense attorneys might try to say that there was a problem issue with his phone, malware, something, and it took longer to update to restart. Well, there's always proof of that. My phone updated yesterday and it took less than 5 minutes. And so that seems odd. But one thing that everybody's focused on possible murders that he committed uh, in the DeSales University area, and so far nothing's come out. I I personally wouldn't be looking at unsolved murders. I'd be looking at unsolved burglaries. Burglaries of vehicles, burglaries of residences, especially residences that are close to known drug areas and known off campus housing areas. All right. That is going to be, to me, that is going to be more telling than anything else. And I'd want to compare if there are any eyewitnesses. I'd want to see if a white Hyundai Elantra was in the area, and I'd want to see if the surviving roommate's account of the suspect is close to matching the suspect. In this case, of course, that's Bryan Kohberger. So where do we sit with all of this? He certainly has the background criminally that I'd expect to see behaviorally. His very I'm above you type of mentality, his intensity, his preoccupation with one interview I read said that he was always wanted to talk about the latest and greatest, most gruesome crime that just happened, and always wanted to bring the subject back to that. But after the murders, he was more reserved. And could that be explained that, because of the proximity, he wanted to be careful? Maybe, but he's not exactly known for wanting to spare people's feelings. So that's a change in behavior. That's something that could be noteworthy. Um, the evidence against him right now, circumstantial as it is, you combine that with his past behavior and everything. If I was leading this investigation and if I wanted to make sure all my ducks were in a row, I would probably want to go out and see if there's another white Hyundai Elantra parked at a high school or college campus. Hyundai Elantras, they're cheap to own, they're cheap to maintain, they're reliable as the day is long. And so, it's an ideal car for a high school or college kid because insurance is cheap, gas is cheap, good gas mileage. I mean, there's just a lot of pros to having them as a first time car. But another thing I'd want to see is I'd want to see if cell phone data can put Bryan Kohberger and any of the victims in that house at different locations together. Now that might be a little harder to do. Digital forensics is not really my thing. I'm a behavior guy, but it would be interesting for me to see just how often his cell phone data overlaps with the victim's cell phone data. And I think that could actually, if Bryan Kohberger is in fact responsible for this, I think that could go a long way to showing stalking behavior, for lack of a better term. So I'm going to stop just short of saying that Bryan Kohberger did it. But if he didn't do it, you are looking for somebody who shares a lot of his same preoccupations, a lot of his same attitudes. And of course, his description, I think he's 6 foot, and the living witness described him as being 5'10" with bushy eyebrows. That's not that's not so far apart in the description. It's not like, they arrested Bryan Kohberger, who's 6 foot, and they described the assailant as 5'6". That's there's less of a difference between in 2 inches than there is in six. But there are so many of these coincidences that have just popped up that it's so hard to think that it could genuinely be anybody else. So, y'all, that's my take on the Bryan Kohberger case as it sits right now. And like I said, this is my analysis, and you know, there's probably other information that is out there, but if I didn't include it in here, it's because I couldn't substantiate it or couldn't uh, thought it did more to muddy the waters than anything else. Um, One concern I have, let me get to this just really quick, is in the book that's been released. The author says that Bryan Kohberger made his way into the house, and it basically implying that somebody in the house, he had either been in there or knew enough about the people in the house to know where he was going. In light of everything that's here, all of the evidence, I'm struggling to find a better way to explain how Bryan Kohberger was able to go to the rooms that he did. Now, was he just interested in starting at the top and working his way down? I don't know. Like I said, they played this investigation very close to the vest, so you'd be taking a lot on speculation, and I'm trying to limit my speculation to uh, what's enhanced, or at least you're not taking a leap of faith to include it. I find it very difficult to think that Bryan Kohberger didn't have some knowledge of what he was doing. Uh, you know, Going to a specific room and how he would have come across that information. I mean, obviously, I think if we can if we had that information right now, that would certainly be the same information that would be used to convict him. But we'll just have to see. That's going to be a crucial part of the case, not only for the defense, and the defense has way too many coincidences that they've got to overcome. And the prosecution, it's not open and shut for them either, because there's there's enough questions of reasonable doubt that if they're raised, and the prosecution can't put something forward that explains that takes away that reasonable doubt. you know um if I was making a prediction, I think they're going to find him guilty. I don't think they're going to move the trial. I know they're trying to get it moved to Boise, a more liberal city that's less likely to impose the death penalty. But in a case like this, given who the victims are, I think the death penalty is on the table no matter where you move it. Um, so so looking at this, I think the prosecution has an easier time, but there's a couple of questions that they're going to have to answer, specifically about. It may not be legally relevant to the case, but the jury is going to think it's relevant. Why did why did he fixate on that house? Why did he fixate on the people he fixated on? Why did he attack the people that he attacked? Why didn't he, there's all these things that are going to have to be explained. And like I said, there's a lot of evidence we don't know yet. This case has been, authorities in this case have been very tight lipped, as well they should be. They want to make sure that justice is done. This is one of those cases where there's just enough circumstantial evidence and just enough there's just enough provable elements that you can get a conviction, but you want to make sure you have everything together, you're able to explain everything, because if you can't, you're going to give one juror that reasonable doubt, and the defendant walks. Okay. you know uh, there's a running joke between prosecutors and defense attorneys. You need to convince 12 people that my client's guilty. Only need to convince one that he's not. So anyway, y'all, that's kind of my takedown. I know we're coming up on an hour and a half, but that's kind of my overly simplified view of this case. And I hope you kind of found it helpful, and maybe if you felt like the case was kind of scattered and you weren't really sure how to look at it, maybe this kind of narrowed things down for you. Joe, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it gave you some different things to think about within the case. And this is kind of where I see it right here. I'm Derek Judd with Cowboy Criminology. Of course, I am the Cowboy Criminologist. We'll see you next time.